Welcome to week 3 of Managing Innovation. This week we focus on barriers to innovation. It's a really important week because it sets us up for the rest of the course, because we really focus on understanding throughout this course how can we work towards overcoming a lot of these barriers. That really is, I think, to a great extent what we'll focus on to the rest. So it's important that we actually understand, well, what are these barriers? What's interesting and sometimes surprising to recognise is that barriers to innovation are created by people, usually unintentionally and often without even realising it. People create structures, rules and processes, all of which can often hinder innovation. As well as that, we often resist change, both actively and passively. So meaning that sometimes we won't even know that we're doing it. We won't be overtly out there resisting innovation, but sometimes we actually actively will be doing that. Now on this slide here, I think this is a really nice quote. Real life is a perpetual compromise between the ideal and the possible. But the world of pure reason knows no compromise, no practical limitations, no barrier to the creative activity. As you listen through to the rest of this lecture, I think this quote will start to make more and more sense. And what we mean really, I think, here is that if we put innovation down on paper, the process of doing it, that's the ideal. That's the world of pure reason. But when we step out of that and come into reality, well, a lot more things start to come into play and you start to see just how challenging it really is. So the real world is so much more messy than what the ideal world is. What are the learning outcomes that we will reach by the end of this lecture and our workshop activities? Well, firstly, it's absolutely important that we define innovation. I know that we're in week 3, and as we've talked about before, definitions are really important. It helps us all make sure that we're on the same page. When we're talking about innovation in this course, we know the way that we're all thinking about that, and that might even be a little bit different than what you might have heard or understood in some of the other courses that you've done here when you're studying innovation. We'll explain the barriers approach to understanding innovation and why it's important for our overall understanding of the innovation process. We'll outline and discuss the range of external and internal barriers that organisations face, and we'll discuss some of the theoretical explanations of these barriers. Particularly explaining the behavioural innovation economics theory. So what that means is then we won't just be looking at these barriers in kind of a descriptive sense, but actually saying, well, how can theory help us actually understand these as well? So I said we'll define innovation. We have talked about this a little bit, but again, why do we keep defining things at university? As I said, it's really important to become a critical and analytical thinker. It's important because not just in our workshops when we're here and we're learning, but also in your written assessment pieces. So you might think this is redundant, why are we doing this again? But you need to be able to define what it is that we're talking about and show your reader, whoever that might be, or your listener, that you understand about a particular topic, and also to make sure that you're setting up that common ground for discussion, which, as we learnt about last week in Interpersonal Communication Skills Week, that can be really tricky if you don't have that common ground. That can start to bring in some of that noise that actually influences the communication pattern, where we might think that we're talking about the same thing, but we haven't defined it properly. We're actually thinking about something a little bit different. So how are we defining innovation here? Innovation is the multi-stage process whereby organisations transform ideas into new or improved products, services or processes in order to advance, compete and differentiate themselves successfully in their marketplace. Now, that might sound like a bit of a mouthful, and you might think there's probably simpler ways of doing that. And look, sometimes there is, and sometimes you'll see more simple definitions of innovation. I think that's really important here that there's a few key things that are recognised. Firstly, that it's a multi-stage process. So we're understanding that there's lots of different steps that will need to go on in the innovation process. Also that it says new or improved. So here again, what we're saying is it doesn't have to be something that's new to the world or even necessarily new to the organization. It might be more of that incremental kind of innovation, just a slight change to something. Then we move on and see that it's products, service, or processes. So again, it doesn't have to be something that's tangible. We don't have to be thinking about a new technical product that's brought into the market. It can be a service, and if you think about some of the biggest innovations that we see around us, Airbnb, Uber, things like that, well, essentially, they actually own almost nothing, don't they? So that's a service innovation, and then processes as well. And what that highlights is that within an organization, inside, it might be nothing that's actually ever delivered to a customer, but what's going on inside the organization, innovating in how they make those products and services is absolutely critical. And then again, thinking about, well, why might an organization do that? So it could be to advance, compete, or differentiate themselves. So more and more you start hearing people talk about innovation's actually critical even just for survival, particularly depending if you're working in a kind of a fast-paced industry where change is happening really rapidly. So there can be lots of different reasons why an organization sets out to innovate. And I've got the reference there if you want to go and have a look. And this is where we've got this innovation definition from. And there's also a nice model there if you like to see things visually, which I absolutely do. And so it just breaks apart some of those different things that are mentioned there in that definition. The innovation problem. Okay, so again, here the reference up there will be working from this paper a lot. So absolutely make sure that you have a look at this particular book chapter. So here they talk about innovation from this innovation problem perspective. So highlighting that most organizations don't actually do enough to try to facilitate innovation. In fact, and we'll talk about this throughout this course, most organizations themselves are actually really set up to be the opposite of facilitating innovation. And what we mean by that is an organization is designed to be efficient. It's designed to have people working towards common goals. It's designed to have people following rules. And all of those things essentially go against the best ways that we can facilitate innovation. So when we think about barriers to innovation, they can happen at the micro level. So that's within people, and we'll absolutely talk about that. We can see at a meso level, so that's within an organization, but also between organizations, and also at a macro level. And there we start looking at a regional or a national level. And there's a nice overview of some of the barriers for Australian organizations at a macro level. It's in the link here in the slides. You can just click on those. Nice and simple, really easy to read. And then also you can have a look at a detailed in the Australian Innovation Systems Report. So in this course, we're focusing much more on that people and that meso within organisation level. But absolutely, it can be really nice to get an understanding of the bigger picture, and so of organisations within Australia. Well, what are those macro level barriers, and just more broadly, not even just barriers, just what is the environment that Australian organisations are working towards. So they're quite easy to read, those reports. If you wanted to have a quick look, just click on the links there. Okay, so again, it's important when we're in university, often we classify things, we put things in groups and things like that, and that can be really helpful because it kind of helps our brain put a framework around things. Our brains like that. Our brains like these kind of simplifications and classifications. So we're going to talk through some of these. So a barrier to innovation is any factor that influences negatively the innovation process. The factors with a positive influence are called facilitators, and we've talked a little bit about this already. But barriers and facilitators are actually related. Facilitators can turn into barriers or vice versa, and they can be the same thing that through different stages of an organization's life cycle or in different stages of the innovation cycle, for example, changes in the external environment, can all turn a facilitator into a barrier or vice versa. So for example, maybe your organization has loose structures and processes which have hindered innovation implementation in the past. It's made it really difficult for things to move through a system. But there's been changes in the external environment, which mean that more rapid response times are required, and maybe some new technologies come in. And what this actually starts to mean is that that barrier, that looseness within your organization is actually now a facilitator to innovation. So really, I guess what you need to always keep in the back of your mind is that barriers or facilitators, what we're talking about, they're context specific. So a certain type of leadership or a certain type of structure, for example, will not always be a barrier, and it will not always be a facilitator. We need to understand what's the situation, what's going on here before we can understand that. It's also really important that we consider some assumptions in the barrier approach, okay? So an implied assumption is that innovation is inherently a good thing, and any resistance to it by employees or managers, which could be interpreted as a barrier, is unwelcome. This isn't always true. Resistance, skepticism can actually be well-founded and a positive action for the good of the firm. And so what we mean here is that it's not always good to go in with the assumption that innovation is good, that just because it is an innovation means that it's good. So some of those barriers, some of that resistance to change or some of that resistance to an idea can actually be good because it can act as a checking mechanism. Hey, is this the innovation our organization needs right now? Or hey, is this an innovation that is actually relevant for the marketplace right now or at any time? It's also frequently assumed that removal of barriers will somehow restore the natural flow of innovation. But this is absolutely far from true because innovation, it's relatively unnatural in the sense that it needs motivation, it needs extraordinary effort, tolerance to risk, coordination, all sorts of things going on. So the removal of barriers is necessary, so it has to happen, but it's not a sufficient condition. Okay, so just because we take away these barriers, that doesn't mean that innovation will happen. A third assumption is that existence of barriers is by itself a bad thing and all efforts should be made to remove them. While this is generally the case, barriers might occasionally turn into positive factors, stimulating innovation or providing valuable learning for the future. For example, learning to live with barriers or the gradual elimination of at a local level might be a necessary first step into the organisation actually internalising a lot of activities that are positive for innovation. Another dubious assumption is that focusing on innovation barriers is more important than focusing on reinforcing positive factors for innovation. So what do we mean by that? Well, that if we keep focusing on, okay, well, let's get rid of all these negatives, what we actually might need to be doing even more so, or at least equally as much, is saying, well, how can we actively facilitate innovation? Later in the course, we'll also talk about people who can act as facilitators and barriers to innovation, and we call these people innovation agents, and that's really quite interesting to have a look at these. I also want to highlight, and this is maybe a little bit of a personal opinion, but there's absolutely research to support this, that above a firm level, when we're thinking about assumptions, when we're thinking about society, we need to question whether all innovation is inherently good or something we want. So even at a societal level, we think of newness, we think of all innovation, it's good, it's something that we want to be doing. But for many things, I think Facebook, for example, there have been some great positives, but also some serious negative impacts on people's lives. So we always need to keep that in the back of our mind. Okay, well, this innovation might be really great for our organisation, for example, but what's it going to mean for society? So it's just really important that we think about these assumptions and that we understand when we're thinking about innovation, there's this pro-innovation bias that often goes into our thinking. So even thinking that we should remove all of these barriers carries with it that assumption. So these are the different barriers that we will be having a look at, and we're going to talk more about these. So I guess just wanted to highlight, why would we look at all of these different levels? So if we're thinking about innovation within an organization, why do we even need to consider all of these different levels, right down from that micro people level up to, external things going on? Well, that's because innovation itself is a multi-level phenomena. And what we mean is that there's lots of levels going on that have to happen for an innovation to go through. So we need to make sure that when we're thinking about barriers, that we actually consider all of those different levels. And as I said, I am about to talk through each of these now in some more detail. So firstly here we have external barriers. So these are things that happen outside of an organisation, and they're also outside of the organisation's control. So here we've got market-related barriers, which are types of market failure and market-induced innovation hampering factors. So firstly, insufficient appropriability. That's a bit of a tricky one to say sometimes, which means that when you innovate, so when you do something new, whether it's a product or a service or a process, it can be difficult to capture the profits from that innovation. So it takes time. So that means that you've got to have a longer term focus, that you've actually got to have enough cash in your organization for the profits to come through for that innovation that you've actually spent maybe a lot of your resources on. And this relates to some of the other points below. Often shareholders of your firm or other stakeholders, if you're in government or a not-for-profit, for example, they want short-term outcomes. And we know that innovations often take a fairly decent amount of time, particularly if we're talking about a new product or quite a substantial change to our processes. It can take a lot of time for that to come to fruition and for us to see the benefits from them. So that can be a market-related barrier to innovation, where organisations will say, look, it's really too difficult for me to take so long for me to recognise or to realise profits from making this change. And then looking at inadequate R&D by private firms. And so we're not talking then about R&D within your organisation. We're talking about what R&D activity is happening in organisations outside of your firm. And so why is this important? Because R&D activity done by other private organisations, often it'll be other organisations that will be in there doing that really challenging or that nuts and bolts R&D activity. So for example, if it's a technical type innovation, a particular type of product or software or something like that, the initial prototyping and testing of the technology or the product and things like that, they're often done by other organisations where they've spent the time, they've undertaken all of that investment of resources. And if that's not going on in your sector or in your region, for example, then you don't kind of get that critical mass of knowledge developing, that ability of other organisations then to take that up and say, okay, we're going to make a product that sits next to that, or the product that's on the other end of the supply chain, all sorts of different things. So you're really relying then upon other organisations as well as yours to be bringing about that knowledge. And then the public good character of innovation. So what we mean by that there can be knowledge leakage and spillover. So, that is, you've developed an innovation within your organisation, but that understanding spills out into other organisations in the sector, and really that reduces the incentives to innovation. So that relates to the point I just mentioned. Innovations do generally leak out of an organisation. You might see a lot of imitations of, phones around. Apple might come up with a really cool product it launched. And then you'll see a lot of other companies start to clamor around and go, actually, I might try that. I might copy or imitate that. So what that means is then that it's more difficult for that organisation who's actually come up with that to actually reap the rewards of that. And then that reduces the incentives for anyone to innovate. Lack of skilled employees. So that one's quite self-explanatory. If you don't have the people within, say if we think about it as a region, for example, you're an organisation, you're in Newcastle or in the Central Coast, you can't find the people who you need, who might have the professional knowledge, the technical knowledge, or whatever it is that you need. If you don't have that within your organisation, then it can make it really difficult for you to actually even develop and implement an innovation. And then lack of innovative users. And so this again, outside of the organisation. But if there isn't people There aren't consumers who are willing to be the first ones to try a product, who are interested in novelty, all of those sorts of things. People are often change resistant. It took quite a long time for people to accept the microwave, for example. So if you don't have that in your organization, in the region or even in the world, then that means that out there in the market, there just might not be the demand for the innovation that you're actually trying to bring in to the market. Again, short-termism. So we talked about this before. That's a market-related barrier. So that might not be just short-termism in terms of within your own organization, but just out there in the marketplace, that essentially a lot of innovation needs a long-term view. But that's really quite lacking in our society. And then again, financial. If there isn't the appetite for, or even the infrastructure, the institutions who are wanting to or willing to fund innovative activity, well, then that absolutely can be a barrier to innovation within organisations. Government. Government's a big one, and obviously this is really, really complex, thinking about the relationship of government activity and what that might mean for an organisation, but we're going to quickly talk about that. Government make policies, usually with the intention of doing good, we hope, and often with the intention of improving our markets, of making it easier to do business. But because of the complexity of doing this, often these regulations and policies create barriers to innovation. Sometimes regulations can seem excessive. We've heard the term red tape, and this can discourage innovative activity in a certain sector. If regulations slow things down, then they can also create a higher risk for organisations by slowing down the innovation process. They'll add complexity. Regulations can enhance risk by making it more costly to innovate, for example. This can mean that it's easier for competitors to catch up with what you're doing and just generally add extra uncertainty to whether an innovation can really be seen through to fruition. These regulations and laws, they're not intended to stop innovation, but it's often an unintended consequence of trying to add protection to consumers and the market. These regulations also can impact firms in different ways. For example, organisations might find it more difficult to meet the regulatory requirements due to a lack of internal systems. So if you're a smaller organisation and some new regulations come in that require more structured and reporting mechanisms, for example, back to government, it can be much more challenging for smaller organisations to start to respond to those newer requirements, whereas a larger organisation might already have the people, the systems in place to do that. So that means it's only a minimal barrier for these larger organisations. On the flip side, though, it can actually sometimes be the lack of regulations and policies and laws that can inhibit innovation. For example, in developing countries, probably less so than in developed countries, but in these developing countries, there might not be the legal frameworks in place that, or maybe they're not very well enforced. For example, intellectual property, IP laws. So what this means, if there's weak IP laws or weak enforcement of IP laws, it can be easier for other organisations to copy, basically, or outright steal the IP of other organisations. And that means then that the original innovating organisation has less ability to reap the rewards of their innovation. So because others can more quickly come in more easily with less cost and copy what they're doing, and they've actually then maybe have spent less time and money on spending to get to that place. So that really reduces the incentive for anyone to innovate, because they know, well, we don't want to spend a lot of time on our R&D because we know it's going to be copied easily by somewhere else. We call a lot of these things that we've talked about institutions. They're political, social, cultural institutions, so they can be formal and informal. And they're things that exist in society, and they put some constraints on us, if you think about it. And for good reasons. But they're also fairly rigid. So these institutions, they help us to work together. They help, large groups of people, big society, big communities. They help them to be able to function and work together when it's not something that you can kind of work around just by informal rules. And they're absolutely required, but there can be institutional inertia. So particularly when we're talking about governments, we know governments can be fairly slow to change, to adapt and shift policies according to the market. So this means then that it's even slower for the external marketplace to kind of keep up with, to set the structures in place that can help organizations at their level even be able to work effectively. So we'll take a quick break now, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the internal barriers, those people and those sorts of things that within an organization that can actually act as a barrier to innovation.